Hello everyone and welcome back to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. We're continuing on with our conversation on population. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about global population distribution, looking at where exactly is it that most people in our world tend to congregate. Last time we talked about the problem with populations growing very quickly in poor countries, especially parts of Asia and Africa. Most of you are probably aware of the fact that China and India are two largest populations in the world today. Now, one thing to note about that is that even though China and India are some of our world's largest populations, they're not necessarily the fastest growing anymore because of either the government policies that were put in place in China, or some of the educational things that have happened in India, and especially some of the wealth creation that's happened in southern India that has caused people to make decisions about having fewer children. Anyway, when we talk about where are people located, we can see in this cartogram here of the world that people tend to congregate, and there are larger populations in certain parts of the world than others. Now, there are actually 5 what we call population clusters in our world today, and they go from East Asia, and that's going to include China, the Koreas, and Japan. Then number 2 we have is South Asia. Number 3 is going to be Europe. That's going to include the United Kingdom and Russia. We have Southeast Asia. That's going to include Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines. And then we have the northeastern United States. And within these 5 different population clusters around the world, what we're going to find is that actually most of our world's 7 billion people are going to live within these 5 different regions. Now, that's for a variety of different factors. You notice that we have kind of a wide range of countries and situations and things along those lines. But those are where most people tend to be congregating. A lot of it has to do with either some historical or recent things that have happened with population. Now, when we talk about population distribution, we want to ask ourselves, why is it that people tend to be congregating in certain areas? And a lot of it has to do, especially historically, with certain environmental factors. There's something about the environment that caused people to congregate in particular areas. And a lot of times also the environment would either encourage the growth of a population or might discourage the growth of a population, especially if we're talking about the prevalence of disease, or we're talking about the difficulty of growing crops or certain types of crops. If you're familiar with Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, then you should be at least somewhat familiar with this idea of the resources that are available to people, things along those lines. So we've looked a little bit at some areas where people tend to be. Some of the places that we find in our world where people tend not to be, they tend not to congregate in these types of environments. And I would think that there's fairly self-explanatory. Places that are too cold, too wet, too hot, and too dry. Now, when we talk about too cold, of course, we're talking about human beings and the ability to survive. Obviously, we don't do very well in cold environments. But not only that, it's very difficult to grow and find food in cold environments, especially vegetation. Obviously, animals can grow and thrive, but raising animals for consumption is very difficult to sustain larger populations. Now, this is one that people typically don't necessarily get right away, and that's areas that are too wet. Areas that are too wet are also very difficult to grow crops that are able to sustain high populations. The large amounts of rainfall a lot of times wash away most of the most fertile soil. Not only that, you tend to have a more prevalence of disease, viruses and bacteria and things that are in the areas that are too wet, because most of the time if it's too wet, it's accompanied also by very humid temperatures or very hot temperatures that allow for growth of bacteria, viruses, those types of things. Places that are too high of an elevation. Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, because Mexico City is not only one of the world's highest cities, but it's also one of the world's largest cities. But places at too high elevation, again, it's very difficult to grow crops. It's very difficult a lot of times for people to acclimate themselves to the environment itself. And a lot of times if it's too high, the soil tends to be thin and rocky and just doesn't sustain crop life very well. Or if it's too dry, places that get very little rainfall, of course, a lot of times we're talking about different forms of deserts and things like that. So when we look at that, you might say, okay, well, those are the places where people don't like to live. So where is it that people do like to live? You'll notice here on our map we see we have a map up here. This would be more, it's not necessarily, I guess you would consider it to be, both of these to be choropleth maps. But you notice that people tend to congregate in areas that are more temperate. You look along the equator, not a tremendous amount of people living along places that are close to the equator, except for parts of Indonesia here. But as we get further away from the equator in some of our more temperate areas, we tend to get larger populations. And there have been arguments and discussions and things like that as to why that has happened over time and why some societies have prospered or not. It's not necessarily part of our conversation today. But there's something to be said for these places of the world having more hospitable environments for humans and larger populations. And you can associate these population clusters with the climatic map down here at the bottom. Now, another thing you'll notice is that most people in the world tend to congregate towards coastal areas, whether it's in the United States or parts of Europe, here in eastern China, South America, really all over the world. You see that most population clusters tend to congregate towards coastal areas, and a lot of that has to do with early population settlements looking for water, looking for water to irrigate their farms and their crops and those types of things, and a lot of our some of our initial trading cities and things like that as world trade began to get started. So a lot of that has some historical elements to it. So it's really a combination of a couple of different things. But again, this map here, we see where it is that those people are congregating. Now, one of the interesting facts is that when we look at population distribution, is that 75% of our world's population only lives on only about 5% of the world's land. And so when we talk about population growth and people being concerned about running out of land and resources and whatever else, it doesn't seem like we'll run out of land anytime soon. Maybe resources, but probably not land as we move forward, because we have figured out ways in which we can seem to fit more and more people on less and less space, and especially with some of the new movements we have going on, especially like urban growth boundaries and trying to contain more people and not allow for larger housing development, especially single-family homes and things like that. The new technologies that we've been able to come up with, more efficient means of energy and electricity, and being able to get more food on less units of land. As we continue to move forward, it seems like because we're able to fit 75% of the global population on 5% of the land, it seems like we have a long ways to go in terms of space for people. And again, it's those people tend to congregate in specific regions around the world, which we've already discussed, and we talked about how typically people tend to look for a hospitable environment. Now, when we talk about places that are a hospitable environment, one word we can use to describe that is what's called the ecumene. Now, the ecumene is defined as an area that holds a permanent human settlement. Okay, so we can see our map over here to the right. If we look back about 5000 BC towards the more ancient world, you see the area that was considered the ecumene. Now, this is where some of our first civilizations are emerging: Eastern Asia, parts of Southwest Asia, Eastern Europe, so forth, so on. But what's happened over time, you can see that new land has been brought into the ecumene, and a lot of that has to do with new technology, greater wealth accumulation, and the technology can be whether it's things like medicinal technologies or agricultural technologies or other innovative technologies like air conditioning, indoor plumbing, heating, those types of things. And so as technology continues to grow, as wealth begins to expand, we notice that the ecumene also begins to expand. So if we start up here in the upper left, okay, you can see how small the ecumene is. As we move down here, this is 81. You can see the ecumene expanding. Over here to the right, this is 1500. The age of exploration. Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue, 1492. Then we're here. This is 1900. We're currently in the year 2014. And so we as a world have been able to develop technologies that have allowed us to move into places that were once considered inhospitable. One of the greatest achievements, I think, in the United States, if you look out in Las Vegas, Nevada, one of the fastest growing states. Las Vegas, does a great job with as far as the casinos and things like that are concerned. In fact, Las Vegas has one of the faster growing suburban populations. And it's in a place that used to be considered completely inhospitable to human settlement. But because of technologies like being able to pipe water out to the land, have air conditioning, for inside, new jobs that began to develop, a growing economy, things like that. People were able to move out to that place and be not only live but also to thrive in those places. So as we move forward in time, who knows? We'll probably be able to bring even more places under settlement so that more people have room to spread out. So that's just a conversation on population distribution around the world, this idea of ecumene, and then also how technology plays a role in that.